They say wisdom is the greatest gift anyone can receive. Yet, what happens when even the wisest man alive fails to live by it? King Solomon, a man whose name became synonymous with divine insight, wealth, and power, met an end so tragic, it serves as a warning across the ages. How could the king who built a temple for God, authored timeless proverbs, and ruled Israel at its peak fall into despair, regret, and spiritual ruin? Picture this: a palace brimming with unimaginable riches, courtyards filled with exotic animals, and Solomon himself, a figure of unmatched splendor. His voice once carried the words of God's wisdom to nations far and wide. But as the golden light of his reign dimmed, Solomon's once revered wisdom was eclipsed by fatal choices, leading to his downfall. Today we unravel the riveting, untold story of Solomon's rise and fall. We'll uncover the subtle cracks that grew into gaping chasms, explore the decisions that sealed his fate, and journey through his heart-wrenching reflections in the final days of his life. This is more than history, it's a cautionary tale for anyone who believes their gifts alone can sustain them. But before we dive in, let me ask you, have you ever wondered what true wisdom really means? Is it knowledge, power, or something far greater? By the end of this story you may have the answer, but it won't be what you expect. If you enjoy exploring stories with powerful lessons and gripping drama, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring more incredible content to you. Let's get started. Before Solomon's name became synonymous with wisdom and wealth, he was just a young man thrust into the weighty role of leading Israel. His father, King David, was a warrior king, a man after God's own heart. But Solomon was different. He wasn't known for his strength in battle or charisma in leadership. What made him stand out was his humility, and it would set the stage for one of the most remarkable stories in history. When Solomon ascended the throne, he could have sought anything: power to crush his enemies, wealth to rival the nations, or long life to secure his reign. Instead, in a dream he asked God for an understanding heart to judge his people and discern between good and evil. This single act of humility changed everything. Imagine the moment: the young king kneeling in prayer, his voice steady but filled with a sense of awe. God in turn was deeply moved. Not only did he grant Solomon unparalleled wisdom, but he also promised him riches and honor beyond any king before or after him. This wasn't just a blessing, it was a divine endorsement. Solomon's early reign was a beacon of hope, a time when Israel thrived under God's favor. But with great gifts come great expectations. God's covenant with Solomon was clear: walk in obedience, follow my commands, and I will establish your throne forever. Yet even in these promising early days, shadows of human frailty lingered. The foundation was strong, but cracks could appear if Solomon ever turned from the path laid out for him. Solomon's prayer for wisdom wasn't just a pivotal moment in his life, it became a symbol of what leadership should be. It's easy to forget that this moment wasn't about Solomon's greatness, it was about God's response to humility. His wisdom wasn't earned, it was gifted, a stark reminder that even the most extraordinary abilities can falter without faithfulness. As Solomon began his reign, his wisdom radiated far and wide. The world watched in awe as the young king ruled with unmatched clarity and insight. Yet, as we'll see, even divine favor cannot override the choices we make. It didn't take long for Solomon's wisdom to captivate not just Israel, but the entire world. The moment that solidified his reputation as a king of divine insight came in a courtroom, where two women stood before him, each claiming to be the mother of the same infant. The stakes were high: life, justice, and truth hung in the balance. How could anyone possibly determine the real mother without witnesses or evidence? In that tense silence, Solomon's voice rang out with a shocking command: "Bring me a sword." The crowd must have gasped in disbelief as he suggested dividing the child in two, giving each woman half. It was a moment of raw tension. Was this truly wisdom, or had the young king lost his mind? But as one woman cried out, "Give her the baby, don't kill him," Solomon smiled. He had his answer. The true mother would rather lose her child than see him harmed. The decision not only resolved the dispute but also revealed a wisdom that went beyond human logic. Word of this judgment spread like wildfire, and people marveled, "Who is this king who speaks with the wisdom of God?" Solomon's ability to solve the unsolvable became his hallmark. His court was a place of order and justice, where even the most complex cases found resolution. But his wisdom wasn't confined to legal matters. It spilled over into every corner of his reign. He was a poet and philosopher, a scientist and statesman. His mind seemed boundless, a reflection of the divine favor upon him. Imagine the scene: dignitaries from distant lands sitting at his feet, absorbing his every word. Solomon spoke of plants, animals, the mysteries of life itself. His proverbs, thousands of them, offered insights into human nature, leadership, and faith. And his songs? Over 1,000 in total, each a masterpiece in its own right. Yet even as his wisdom expanded his influence, it carried a quiet danger. Solomon's growing fame meant the world watched his every move. Could anyone bear the weight of such expectations? For now, his wisdom seemed unshakable, a gift that elevated Israel to unprecedented glory. But wisdom, as we'll see, is no guarantee against failure. Solomon's wisdom wasn't just a personal gift, it was the cornerstone of Israel's golden age. Under his reign, the nation experienced an unprecedented era of peace and prosperity. Trade routes that once seemed out of reach were now bustling highways of commerce, stretching across continent. Foreign kings sent envoys with treasures, eager to align themselves with the legendary ruler whose wisdom was said to rival the gods. One of Solomon's most celebrated achievements was his literary legacy. He wrote 3,000 proverbs, each one a nugget of divine insight, and over 1,000 songs. His works touched on themes as diverse as leadership, the natural world, faith, and human relationships. These weren't just words on parchment, they were lessons handed down through generations, shaping the moral fabric of societies long after his time. But Solomon's influence wasn't confined to words. He turned his gaze toward the heavens and the earth, studying the mysteries of creation. Imagine the king walking through gardens filled with rare plants, his scholars gathering around him as he described the secrets of trees, birds, and creeping things. His wisdom bridged the divine and the natural, offering a glimpse into God's handiwork. Among Solomon's many admirers was the Queen of Sheba. The stories of her visit are legendary. She traveled across deserts, bearing gifts of gold, spices, and precious stones, to witness the truth of Solomon's wisdom for herself. Her arrival in Jerusalem was a spectacle, camels laden with riches, her entourage shimmering with opulence. But none of that prepared her for the splendor of Solomon's court. As she questioned the king, her skepticism melted away. Every answer he gave exceeded her expectations. She marveled not only at his intellect but also at the order of his kingdom. "The half was not told to me," she confessed, acknowledging that Solomon's greatness surpassed the legends. Her visit became a testament to his unparalleled renown. But perhaps Solomon's crowning achievement was the temple in Jerusalem. This wasn't just a building, it was a symbol of God's presence among his people. Constructed over 7 years, the temple was a marvel of architecture and devotion. Gold covered nearly every surface, reflecting the glory of God. The Ark of the Covenant found its home there, and during its dedication, Solomon prayed one of the most heartfelt prayers recorded in Scripture, asking God to dwell among his people and to forgive them when they turned back to him. On the day of the dedication, the temple's courtyard was filled with worshippers. As Solomon concluded his prayer, fire descended from heaven, consuming the sacrifices, and the glory of the Lord filled the temple. It was a moment of divine affirmation, a reminder that God's favor rested on Solomon and Israel. Under Solomon's rule, Israel reached heights of prosperity that were almost mythical. Gold and silver flowed into the kingdom in such abundance that silver was considered of little value. Ships brought exotic goods, ivory, apes, and peacocks, from distant lands, showcasing the reach of Solomon's influence. His throne, made of ivory and overlaid with gold, became a symbol of his unmatched power and wealth. Yet, amidst this prosperity, subtle cracks began to form. Wealth and wisdom, though gifts from God, could become distractions. Solomon's lavish lifestyle grew increasingly extravagant, and his alliances with foreign nations brought influences that would later pull him away from his devotion to God. For now, however, the splendor of Solomon's achievements captivated the world, and Israel stood as a beacon of divine blessing. As Solomon's kingdom flourished, so did his personal wealth and extravagance. He was no longer just a king, he was a living legend. Every aspect of his life seemed larger than life. His palace was adorned with gold, his throne made of ivory overlaid with gold, flanked by 12 lions that symbolized his unmatched dominance. Every goblet in his court was crafted from pure gold. Silver, they said, was too common to be of use. The annual tribute Solomon received from his allies and vassals was staggering. Over 25 tons of gold flowed into the kingdom every year, not to mention the wealth accumulated from his extensive trade networks. Solomon's fleets of ships brought treasures from distant lands, exotic animals, spices, and even peacocks to decorate his courts. He was not just a king, he was a collector of the world's finest things. But wealth and power often come with a hidden cost. Solomon's alliances, sealed through marriages to foreign princesses, were strategic but spiritually dangerous. By the end of his reign, he had amassed 700 wives and 300 concubines, a staggering number even by the standards of ancient royalty. These marriages were not just about love or family, They were political tools to secure peace and alliances with surrounding nations. Yet, these alliances came with strings attached. Many of Solomon's wives brought with them the gods of their homelands. Temples and altars to foreign deities began to appear throughout Israel, often at the behest of Solomon himself. He justified these constructions as acts of diplomacy, but in doing so, he began to drift further from the God of Israel. Imagine the irony. The man who built the temple for the one true God was now erecting altars to gods who demanded detestable practices, including child sacrifices. Solomon's actions didn't go unnoticed. The people of Israel, once united under a king they admired, began to whisper of his hypocrisy. How could a man with such wisdom ignore the very commandments he had once upheld? With each compromise, Solomon's heart grew more divided. His lavish lifestyle, once a symbol of God's blessing, now became a distraction. The man who wrote, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding," was leaning heavily on his wealth, alliances and pleasures. The cracks in his spiritual foundation were growing wider. By the time Solomon realized the depth of his error, the damage was already done. The altars to foreign gods stood as monuments to his compromises. His relationships, once political assets, had become spiritual liabilities. And the people of Israel, though enjoying the prosperity of his reign, began to drift into the same idolatry that plagued their king. Solomon's choices serve as a stark reminder. Wisdom, wealth, and power are gifts, but they are no substitute for faithfulness. His life shows us how easy it is to rationalize small compromises until they become insurmountable obstacles. The very gifts that elevated him to greatness were now pulling him away from the God who gave them. Yet even as Solomon's heart wandered, God's patience endured. His warnings through prophets and divine encounters would echo in Solomon's mind, urging him to return to the path of obedience. But for now, Solomon's story took a darker turn, as his lavish lifestyle and fatal choices paved the way for the kingdom's eventual fracture. Solomon's decline didn't come in a single moment. It crept in like a slow-moving shadow, as his heart gradually drifted from God. The very man who had once prayed for wisdom, seeking an understanding heart to lead his people, now found himself pulled in countless directions, his devotion diluted by distractions, wealth, and foreign influences. At the core of his spiritual unraveling was idolatry. Solomon's many foreign wives brought their gods into his kingdom. At first, these idols may have seemed like mere symbols of diplomacy, gestures to maintain peace with his new allies, but over time they became more than political tools. Altars to Ashtoreth, Chemosh, and Molech, the gods of neighboring nations, began to rise in Israel, each a monument to compromise. Some of these gods demanded horrifying practices, including child sacrifice, something the God of Israel had condemned in the strongest terms. Imagine the once proud king standing before an altar to Chemosh, his hands stained not with blood, but with complicity. The people who had admired Solomon's devotion now saw a king torn between his God and the gods of his wives. His actions sent a ripple effect through the nation. If the king himself wavered, what hope did the people have of remaining steadfast? This wasn't ignorance on Solomon's part. God had appeared to him not once but twice, delivering clear warnings about the dangers of idolatry and disobedience. In 1 Kings 9 verses 6-7, God made a covenant. "But if you or your descendants turn away from me and do not observe the commands and decrees I have given you, and go off to serve other gods and worship them, then I will cut off Israel from the land I have given them." Solomon knew the stakes, yet he continued down this perilous path. The spiritual consequences of Solomon's actions were profound. His divided heart not only weakened his relationship with God but also set a dangerous precedent for Israel. The nation began to mirror its king, turning to idols and adopting the practices of surrounding nations. The people who had once sung praises to God at the dedication of the temple now bowed at altars to foreign deities. Reflecting on Solomon's writings, particularly Ecclesiastes, we catch a glimpse of his inner turmoil. The once confident king who declared that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom now wrote words filled with regret. Everything is meaningless. A chasing after the wind. Solomon, who had tasted the fullness of God's blessings, found himself empty. His pursuits of wealth, power, and pleasure had led him to a sobering realization. Without God, even the greatest achievements amount to nothing. His spiritual decline also fractured his legacy. God's warning to Solomon wasn't just a personal rebuke, it was a prophecy for the future of Israel. The once unified kingdom, a beacon of divine favor, would soon be torn apart. The prophet Ahijah later confirmed this grim fate, revealing that 10 tribes would be taken from Solomon's descendants as a direct consequence of his disobedience. Even in the midst of his decline, there were flickers of the man Solomon had once been. His writings reveal moments of deep introspection, where he recognized the futility of his ways. But by the time these reflections emerged, it was too late to undo the damage. The seeds of division had already been sown, and the consequences were inevitable. Solomon's spiritual decline is a stark reminder of the dangers of compromise. It shows us how even the wisest among us are vulnerable to the temptations of pride, wealth, and worldly desires. For all his wisdom, Solomon lacked the one thing he needed most: an undivided heart fully committed to God. As Solomon's heart turned away from God, the consequences of his actions began to unfold. What had once been a unified kingdom, glowing with divine favor, now stood on the brink of division. Solomon's choices were not just personal, they had national implications, and God's judgment was about to make them clear. The first warning came from a prophet named Ahijah. One day Ahijah approached Jeroboam, a young official in Solomon's court, with a dramatic message. He tore a new cloak into 12 pieces and handed 10 to Jeroboam. "Take these," he said, "for this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I am going to tear the kingdom out of Solomon's hand and give you 10 tribes. This prophecy was a declaration that Solomon's unfaithfulness would cost his dynasty the United Kingdom of Israel. Imagine Solomon's reaction when he heard whispers of this prophecy. The king who had once basked in God's favor now faced the bitter reality of divine judgment. His once unshakable throne, built on the foundations of obedience and wisdom, was beginning to crumble. Despite his immense power, Solomon could not escape the consequences of his disobedience. But God's judgment was not a complete rejection. In his mercy, God allowed Solomon to rule until his death, ensuring the kingdom would not split during his lifetime. This was not for Solomon's sake, but for the sake of his father, David, a man after God's own heart. However, the cracks in Solomon's legacy were evident, and the future of Israel hung in the balance. As the years passed, the signs of division became more apparent. Solomon's policies, once seen as wise and effective, began to weigh heavily on the people. His lavish spending and ambitious projects required heavy taxation and forced labor. The very people who had once celebrated his wisdom now grumbled under the burden of his rule. The fractures in the kingdom, both spiritual and political, grew wider. The judgment pronounced on Solomon's reign serves as a stark reminder of God's justice. Solomon's wisdom had elevated him to heights no king before him had reached, but his failure to remain faithful brought him low. His story reveals a sobering truth. No amount of power, wealth, or intellect can shield us from the consequences of turning away from God. In his later years, Solomon may have felt the weight of this judgment. His writings in Ecclesiastes reflect the tone of a man wrestling with the consequences of his life's choices. "What do people gain from all their labors at which they toil under the sun?" he asked. It's the lament of a man who had everything yet found it all to be meaningless without God. Even as the kingdom prepared for division, God's mercy remained evident. The promise to David, that his lineage would endure, was not forgotten. While 10 tribes would break away under Jeroboam, the tribe of Judah would remain under the rule of Solomon's descendants. This small remnant would carry the thread of God's plan forward, leading ultimately to the birth of the Messiah. As Solomon's reign drew to a close, the weight of his choices loomed large. His wisdom, wealth, and power could not save him from the judgment he had brought upon himself and his people. His story serves as both a cautionary tale and a testament to God's unwavering justice and mercy. In his final years, Solomon, the man who had been granted divine wisdom, stood as a shadow of his former self. His wealth, his power, and his influence, all the things he had once celebrated, now seemed hollow. The king who had built the magnificent temple, who had ruled over a united Israel at its zenith, found himself grappling with the emptiness of a life that had drifted far from God. These reflections are immortalized in the book of Ecclesiastes. It is unlike any other book attributed to Solomon, a raw, brutally honest examination of the human condition. The opening words set the tone: meaningless, meaningless. Everything is meaningless. It is the cry of a man who had reached the pinnacle of human achievement, only to realize it offered no lasting fulfillment. Through Ecclesiastes, we catch a glimpse of Solomon's tortured soul. He recounts how he pursued wealth, pleasure, knowledge, and great accomplishments. He built houses, planted vineyards, and amassed treasures. He surrounded himself with music, laughter, and luxury. And yet, at the end of it all, he confessed, "This too is meaningless, a chasing after the wind." Imagine the king sitting alone in one of his grand palaces, the halls eerily silent despite their opulence. The wisdom that once illuminated his path now illuminated his regrets. He had traded the eternal for the temporary, and the weight of that realization was crushing. Solomon's reflections go beyond personal regret. They speak to the universal human experience. He warns against the seductive pull of materialism, the fleeting nature of pleasure, and the futility of striving without purpose. These words resonate across centuries because they come from a man who had everything the world could offer yet found it all lacking. But even in his despair, Solomon found clarity. Toward the end of Ecclesiastes, he offers a profound conclusion: fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the duty of all mankind. It is a return to the simplicity that had defined his early reign, a reminder that true wisdom begins and ends with God. As Solomon approached the end of his life, the kingdom he had so meticulously built teetered on the edge of division. His sons, lacking his wisdom and unity of purpose, would inherit a fractured legacy. The prophecy of Ahijah, foretelling the division of Israel, loomed ominously. The weight of Solomon's choices would not only affect him but generations to come. And yet, there is something deeply human in Solomon's reflections. They remind us that failure does not negate the possibility of redemption. While his life ended with regret, his writings stand as a timeless testimony to the lessons he learned. They challenge us to consider our own pursuits, to ask whether we are chasing after the wind or living with eternal purpose. In his closing words, Solomon offers a simple yet profound truth. Life's ultimate meaning is found in reverence for God and obedience to his will. This conclusion is both humbling and hopeful. It acknowledges the mistakes of the past while pointing to a future grounded in faith. As Solomon's life came to an end, the man once celebrated for his wisdom left behind a complex legacy. His story is one of glory and tragedy, of divine blessing and human failure. Yet, through his reflections, Solomon continues to teach us, urging us to seek what truly matters. Solomon's story is one of extraordinary highs and devastating lows. His wisdom, wealth, and achievements were unparalleled, yet they were not enough to save him from the consequences of his choices. The man who started his reign with humility and faith ended it in regret and spiritual turmoil. But even in his failings, Solomon's life holds powerful lessons. His reflections in Ecclesiastes teach us that life's pursuits, whether wealth, power, or pleasure, are ultimately meaningless without a connection to the eternal. Solomon's final words, "Fear God and keep his commandments," echo across the ages, urging us to center our lives on what truly matters. As we consider the legacy of King Solomon, we are reminded of the fragility of human nature and the enduring power of God's grace. His story is a cautionary tale about the dangers of compromise and the importance of remaining faithful. Yet it also shows us that even in our mistakes, there is room for redemption and wisdom to be found. So, what will your legacy be? Will it be one of fleeting pursuits, or will it reflect a life lived with purpose and reverence for God? The choice is ours, but Solomon's life stands as a guide, pointing us toward the path of true meaning. If you found this story inspiring, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more captivating stories and lessons. Together, let's seek wisdom, purpose, and the things that truly endure. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.